Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le Bunga, Bunga.
Hello, listener. This is BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hokuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and this podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare in the UK. In this week's episode, George talks to Jason Myles, who's the host of This is Revolution podcast, a columnist at Sublation, and a musician. And the conversation is about whether the contemporary left is a lifestyle brand feeding into the all-encompassing politics of the spectacle, and what role music has to play in that. And remember, if you like BungaCast, make sure to rate and review us. And if you really like BungaCast, join us over at patreon.com/BungaCast for 2 original episodes a month and more. Enjoy.
So I'm very glad today to be joined by Jason Myles, who's one of the hosts of This is Revolution, and now back on YouTube, you guys are, right?
Yes, we are. We got taken down for a strike for cyberbullying with an episode that I did many years ago, 3 years ago, with Robbie Martin. If you might be familiar with his sister Abby Martin, and Robbie had done some extensive work on kind of a history of where QAnon comes from. And we were just having a discussion about the work he did. We didn't call anyone any names. We weren't laughing at QAnoners. And it was the last thing I did in studio. I used to actually do this show using the same platform you guys use, actually, in West Oakland. And so that was the last thing I did. So I was very sad. They took the whole thing down.
Oh, yeah. Sorry to hear about that. And cyberbullying. Yeah. I mean, don't do it, kids. But I'm not sure what that amounts to. But no, great show. And I'm sure many of our listeners already know about it. But just on the off chance that you don't, definitely check it out. So yeah, the first thing we wanted to talk about was basically music, because you're a musician, and I have this theory that podcasts are basically bands for people like me who couldn't play instruments and basically weren't cool enough to get into a band without being good on an instrument. So, if you do a podcast, you practice, you record, you occasionally do live gigs. But what's for an actual musician, somebody who plays instruments, what's the life of a musician like in 2023, kind of post pandemic? Are people going back to gigs now, or is it still a bit of tough after the past couple of years?
Well, I stopped because the show is definitely more successful than the fledgling career I had doing music for all those years, traveling all over the place. But it is an interesting world that people are in, because you're seeing musicians be a little more honest with the situation they're being forced with. And you're also seeing more people talk about concert fees. And that only really applies to people playing a decent sized room. And those fees are for merch. And
right.
Most decent sized rooms and everywhere is different. And over the last, I would say, like 6-7 years in the States, I can only speak for the States. I don't know what the situation is like over there anymore. But a lot of the larger promoters that were involved in these big music festivals, like Coachella, for example, like Golden Voice, they started getting into smaller rooms, and they were definitely taking merch fees in smaller rooms. So I think what you're seeing is probably because when bands came back, it wasn't you went right back to the big rooms you were playing unless you were a very large established artist. To get people to come out, first and foremost, you needed to have pretty big names. So one thing I'm seeing happening with music is that much smaller places just closed in general, and places that are fighting to stay open are taking house cuts for merchandise, which can range anywhere from, depending on the size of the place, 20 to like 40% of your merch. So
Wow.
So even before the pandemic, people were bigger. I mean, like much, much larger acts would get a spot, like let's say an empty storefront, and just set up and sell stuff there and make it kind of an event out of it, to avoid that huge merch cut. Because there's also other fees involved depending on if it's a union house and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my kind of understanding is that in the past, since I as a youth, went to more gigs than I do now, like merch is more important. Live, like ticket receipts are more important because selling CDs, that dates me to Stephen saying that. That kind of revenue model doesn't really exist anymore. So getting 40% of your sort of your merch sales, does that make it basically not viable anymore? Because we've had a previous guest on the podcast who was a sociologist of basically cultural production, and all his research was basically it's way more middle class kids in bands now, because you basically need to be able to kind of afford to do that yourself. You can't, it's not sustainable without a bit of or quite a lot of parental help potentially.
Yes, you can't sustain it to the level. You have to really be wanting to live on the margins if you want to try to do it for real. And also think about it like this. First of all, in the States, there's no music in schools. First and foremost, who can afford to buy instruments? There's a reason why you see so many electronic stuff. Who could afford studio time? A lot of people record at home, and there's pluses and minuses to being able to record at home. Because just because you can record at home doesn't mean you know how. Doesn't mean you know how to mix. It doesn't mean you know how to master. So, and then you throw the kind of the ticket sale monopoly on top of that too. Everybody has to go through Ticketmaster. You can,
and they take their booking and handling fee and shipping fee, even if it's an e-ticket. So
even if it's an e-ticket, it's super expensive. So I mean, if you're doing stuff at a smaller level, the last tour we did, my band Bitter Lake we did North America, and earlier that year we had done a super DIY Brazil tour.
That's I mean, obviously we have a Brazilian connection, Brazilian correspondent on the podcast. I mean, that is quite a romantic idea, a kind of DIY trek round. I mean, you don't get to do that as a podcaster very often. It's more screen time and less kind of trekking around Brazil in the back of a van with guitars and amps. But I'm guessing this story, there's going to be a downside to this tour.
No, well, I mean, the downside I won't get into. It's an off-air conversation, as we say on TIR.
Right.
But people were showing up at these shows because we were main support for a decent size independent band. I think they're signed now, but people were showing up and they were trying to do their best to avoid the Ticketmaster charges. We were playing kind of small to mid-sized rooms, and it was fun. Like, I do, as much as I love the podcast, I just did a live thing with Ben Burgess and Matt Chrisman and Amber Ailey Frost from Chapo at University of California, Irvine. I did that like a couple days ago. That was fun. It was fun. And then we had, like, speaking of, podcasters as musicians, we had a kind of after party, if you will.
I'm getting a very clear picture of podcast after party, like the coolest of the cool, certainly.
At Catherine's Lou's house, and that is as close as I was going to get to those after show moments. And that's kind of what I miss. You can't stage dive at a live podcast event. I definitely miss stuff like that.
Well, maybe you could, but all the people sitting there might be a little bit perplexed as you're kind of falling towards them. As to what you're supposed to do.
They would part like the Red Sea.
But I think to kind of I mean, obviously there was this podcasting is the new punk analysis, which
Yeah.
many listeners and friends sent to me, almost all with tongue in cheek. But I think there is something here. I don't want to like make the connection too much, but obviously music is you have to be in person. Well, it doesn't have to be live, but that's when it's best. A podcast is maybe the kind of the way to form a band in our kind of posting alone, our bowling alone times. Like it is, you can, we're talking via screens. We're not in the same place you're in early morning in California, which I've already apologized.
No, we're all good. I told you we're all good. We're all good.
And I'm in pollen fueled London. But yeah, I mean, I guess to kind of yeah, I won't belabor that too much, but I guess kind of wanted to start on that because we had some questions we wanted to talk about because you've written a lot about culture in general, but particularly, I guess, the intersection of maybe music culture and political culture, you could put it that way. But yeah, just to kick it off with pop music, what's your take on the kind of the role of pop music in culture, subculture, counterculture today? Is it dead or is it yeah, big question. I mean, there's the easy question to start with, and then second question, bam, get straight into it. What's your, do you think this has changed, or is just does pop music still exist?
Well, of course it exists because Taylor Swift is still, demanding and getting, ridiculous sums of money, and she's selling out very large rooms. And if you look at who's making the most money for concert tours, I don't know if you would say it's all pop artists, but I think there's still a demand for that kind of music. But what's interesting to me is like I'm not really seeing a lot of new artists. I mean, there's new artists, of course, but not to that level that we saw new artists. And there is something to be said about the fragmentation of music through algorithms. Sorry. So I mean, I don't think pop music is always going to change, right? It's what's popular. I don't think it's always going to sound like Sonny and Cher. It's going to morph into something that's a little hip hop, a little synthetic. I still think it's somewhat manufactured, like it was in the early days of Brill Street with what they called rock and roll. They didn't even call it pop back then. It was just still rock and roll. So, which is some of the new work I'm doing now for something I'm working on involving Milli Vanilli, and we'll probably talk about it later.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, Milli Vanilli. For we could just go into that now a little. For listeners who don't know about Milli Vanilli, one, obviously you should watch. Was it like a MTV Music Awards performance, or yeah? Tell us a little bit about
Milli Vanilli. Where to start? So the Milli Vanilli is a group that hits in like 1989, and it's a duo. And their sound is very late 80s, early 90s, a mix of kind of dancey R&B music with a little bit of hip hop infusion. Kind of, if you're familiar, people, or I don't know how many black people listen, people are familiar with groups like Belle Biv DeVoe and stuff like that. Milli Vanilli was kind of a little, I guess around that same time. And they did a performance in, I think it was June of 89, where they were doing their thing. They had a song called Girl, You Know It's True, and the tape playback machine got stuck, and it went, Girl, you know it's, girl, you know it's, and so it got stuck. And the guy who was lip syncing this part ran off stage, and a conversation got started about lip syncing in pop music. And I don't know if you remember this, Janet Jackson, I think something that's similar had happened to her. And so there was this whole conversation about, is lip syncing real? Does it mess with the performance? Here we are so many years later and nobody really cares. But what happened was, the real story is Milli Vanilli wanted more money for their second record. And the man that produced them and kind of made them, a man named Frank Farian, who, if you have a lot of listeners from across the pond, had a very famous group called Boney M. And Boney M, in reality, was Frank Farian pitching his voice up for the female parts and down for the male parts. Frank Farian comes to prom. Well, he wanted to be a more R&B singer, and people told him no one's going to listen to. I think he's German, a German white guy sing R&B, and so he didn't think that was true. He released a record. It didn't hit. He decided to do this pitch his voice up and down thing. Boney M sold tens of millions of records until the male avatar decided he didn't want to do it anymore. He didn't like it. So Frank Farian had heard the song "Girl You Know It's True" from a group called Newmarks in Baltimore. It was a single they had out. It didn't hit. It hit in Germany in the clubs. So Farian tried to replay everything in his state-of-the-art studio, and he finds the guys that would be Milli Vanilli. Milli Vanilli is a name that Frank Farian gave to his girlfriend at the time that worked at his studio. Her name was Millie. And so he finds these guys who are actually musicians. I always thought they were models. Through the research I found out, they actually were musicians. They actually had a group called Empire Bazaar, kind of R&B-ish.
Good name.
It actually was a cool name. They had a cool album cover for it too. And so you can find this stuff online. And so Frank Farian says, hey, here's the song. Here's a bunch of money. For them, it was a bunch of money. I think he gave them the equivalent of about $5,000 and paid their bills. And so they signed this deal, and they go back to the studio, and they're like, okay, when do we record the song? He goes, oh no, dumbass, the song's recorded. You guys are you're gonna mime this, dude. And so they figure, because dance music comes and goes, it's so quick in the imagination of people, right? And so they figured, all right, we'll do this thing. It's just a gig. And then the song ended up hitting. The next thing they knew, they were getting flown to the US, and it kind of took off on them. They ended up selling like 30 million records. And then, because they want more money for the second go round, Frank Farian, who had warned them upon signing the deal, don't ever F with me, he outs them. He goes, hey, everything they're doing is fake. These guys are big phonies. So they decide they won a Grammy. They won 2 Grammys.
Yeah.
They won 3 American Music Awards. They won Best New Artist at the Grammys, which is like this big time award. So if you look at Best New Artist for the Grammys, there's only one year that someone didn't get it, and it's 1990 because Milli Vanilli gave theirs back. And then they Frank Farian tried to release a record with the actual singers, and no one bought it. Milli Vanilli, of course, who actually has some musical talent, tried to release a record. They actually did release a record, but sadly the label was going under literally when they signed them. And so if you hear the numbers, it sounds like kind of off. Like they only sold 2,000 records for the thing they released, but the label had no money. It went under, but they sold all 2,000 copies of whatever they had. So one of the members ends up dying. Some say of an accidental alcohol poisoning, drug overdose. Some say suicide. Milli Vanilli had actually went back with Frank Farian and recorded a second record that has never seen the light of day. But my work on this is kind of like the idea of authenticity, because
I mean, this is exactly what I was going to ask, because I guess name Milli Vanilli, first thing I think is that like lip syncing, like the guy having to repeat the phrase, and so, but I guess like why is that bad? Don't we? Because we kind of know that this must happen, but we don't want to be able to, we don't want our suspension of disbelief to be interrupted. We want to just like have the spectacle, enjoy the performance, be allowed to enjoy it. So what? I mean, I guess this sounds like an interesting place to start to think about authenticity. Were they authentic or not? I mean, I guess how are you like playing that idea of authenticity through the pop greats, Milli Vanilli?
The pop greats. First of all, there was a massive backlash. Like, we look at this as the scandal of all scandals is Milli Vanilli, right?
Yeah,
we were fooled, and again for younger people that don't remember. So after this happened, the little bit of money that they made, most of it got soaked up in lawsuits because they started getting sued left and right. There's a saying in the music business where there's a hit, there's a writ. And so these guys got sued, and that one of the lawsuits, the guy said that he liked the song and the image of the band so much that he was so hurt he had emotional distress whenever he would look at the record. So the label,
Wow.
To try to stop all these class action lawsuits, said, or I think it was part of a class action lawsuit, said they'll give you $1 back for every CD you return. They'll give you $2 back for every concert ticket, and you got so much back for a CD. And
Right.
about 300,000 people, this is what's documented, replied, and no one
Wow.
knows if they actually got paid out any money. There's no way to find out. But what's interesting about this is, if you go all the way back to the 50s, a movie like West Side Story, that's not Natalie Wood singing those parts. That's another woman.
Yeah.
And she was known, and it was known. She was on a game show. She was like, "You may know me as the voice of these." She sang all the parts for Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady. And these are musicals.
Yeah. So what changes then, or why is that Milli Vanilli kind of scandal so shocking that people are being traumatized just looking at the record and considering like angrily sending back their CDs or collecting them from friends and family to try and make a few dollars? What is it that
Dollar
like by
back.
the late 80s 90s we need in pop music that we didn't previously?
Well, if you think about the way that we produced music, there was a lot of Fortis production in music as well. There's a factory system. Phil Spector is not a musical genius as much as he is kind of a good project manager. And the team of people, and if you're bored and music fans, they were called the Wrecking Crew. And they were a team of musicians that played on everything from TV show theme songs, jingles, pretty much every big record. And they thought of themselves as, first of all, they were a little older, and they were mostly jazz musicians. And they were writing a lot of these lines. And when we think about music and what's classic, we don't think, like, if you're a Beach Boys fan, if you knew that those dudes didn't play the instruments, or Carol Kay wrote some of those bass lines you thought Brian Wilson wrote, do you look at the Beach
You'd be
Boys any
sad.
different?
I didn't know that Brian Wilson didn't. I thought Brian wrote all of it, and the rest of them were just doing the harmonies.
Well, again, what happens is, you go in this room, this massive studio, right? And the idea is that the producer is some sort of Svengali that either created the music, or he's pulling something out of the artist. And in this era, the producer is literally just the guy making sure that the project is running on time. I had heard something really interesting. Darlene Love, if you've ever seen the Lethal Weapon movies, she's the woman that plays Danny Glover's wife. Darlene Love is a famous background singer, but she's also the actual singer for some of the biggest hits in rock history. He's a Rebel, that's Darlene Love. That's not the Crystals. The first time the Crystals heard that song, they were on tour on the other side of the country, and they're like, "We didn't sing this. Who is that?"
Wow.
and she went uncredited.
That'd be quite strange, right? Just being like, "Oh yeah, I don't quite remember doing that one, but it sounds pretty good." So yeah, good on me.
This was a lot more common. I wouldn't necessarily say it's all that accepted, but it was common, and it just was what it was. And if you listen to people like Carol Kay, that was part of the Wrecking Crew, talk about a lot of her uncredited work, she was like, "I'm glad people didn't know who we were, because they probably wouldn't have bought those records if they would have seen the people that were making them, because again, they thought they were so uncool and not hip." And ultimately, this is a moment where we're selling an idea of what rebellion is, of what fun is, because the teenager is still a new thing. It's a brand new market that's being created by not teenagers, which I find funny too. So our ideas wrapped around authenticity really come out in the next generation, where you get the singer-songwriter, and this is authentic music. And even with Milli Vanilli, if you think about that time, they hit around the same time that not just Yo MTV Raps hits, but also MTV does the show Unplugged. And Unplugged is to be the real, authentic music performance, because look, they're unplugged. And I'm like, dude, I don't care. Do you dig the tune? Then you dig the tune.
Well, yeah, I guess there is that, just thinking of that famous Bob Dylan performance where, somebody shouts Judas because he's playing it like
Plugged in.
playing
Like
electric guitar,
guitar. Yeah.
like playing plugged in. And I guess there is, that is more technology, more mediation. I guess though, one thing which, like, hearing you talk through all of that and applying it back to podcasting, I wonder if there is going to be a kind of podcasting lip sync kind of scandal where it turns out that actually, some famous podcasters haven't been saying their parts. They've brought in a voice actor or somebody who's like more intelligent. This doesn't happen on Bungacast, I mean, if it did, you'd think we'd at least get more people with nicer voices and better things to say. But no, I guess this idea of like authenticity
Mm-hmm.
and having something artistically important to say. I just wonder how it's connected to something else that you've written about, this idea of selling out. Not to say that you're a sellout, but that you've written about. I should just make that clear. This was a cardinal sin like 25 years ago, right? This was the slacker was not going to sell out and kind of, I guess, retain that authenticity or something like that. But now it seems a bit more like there's certainly at least a part of the industry which is like, if you don't sell out, you're missing out. You're like an idiot. You're basically conning yourself, because that's what you're there for. It's not a hobby. It's not anything artistic. It's just, here's the market. If you get a chance to sell out, sell high. What's this like change? What do you reckon? How has this come about? Because because obviously you've written on this.
The idea of selling out is really interesting to me, because I think it varies for every person. And I did start this idea of this piece about Milli Vanilli with the idea of something that we do deal with in our industry, and that's the idea of everyone's a grifter. And I've never liked that term, because there are real con men in the world. And I don't know if there's con men that want to do left, quote, content creation, because there's not a lot of money in it. There just isn't. And anyone that says there is not telling the truth. There's more money in comedy podcasts and true crime podcasts, and that's if I'm selling out, that's what I'm doing. But I struggle with that, because I used to think selling out was doing something like, as a musician, if I was playing something that I didn't like, and then kind of hearing and meeting musicians over the years. So I used to live in a warehouse in West Oakland that was a music rehearsal and recording studio. And in there, every band in the Bay Area that you can imagine, and some people from your neck of the woods. I remember The Cure was there for 3 months doing some rehearsals for a US run they were doing. So, and I lived in Third Eye Blind's old room, so I got to know a lot of
Third Eye Blind, semi-charmed. Were you living a semi-charmed kind of life?
I was living on the margins in a little bitty freaking rat-filled room with my now ex. But you also meet people that are in cover bands and somewhat successful cover bands, and those are the guys that were making a decent amount of money. And sometimes you see cats going to like 4 rehearsals in a day. And when I was younger, I used to look at that as selling out. But you see the amount of work that people do to just play. Like, I just want to play. And when you listen to the Wrecking Crew talk about what they were doing back then, these people weren't compensated that much for the amount of work they did, because again, this was going uncredited, so they didn't get residuals on these records, and they're still happy to be a part of it. And they were just like, dude, I was going to work, and this was the only way I was going to be able to play my instrument and work, and this was cool to me. And I, I guess selling out is not being your authentic self and not telling the truth. And even when these guys are in cover bands, I still see them put their own little flair on stuff. And unless tomorrow, George, you start Zig Heiling and you're like, I'm full fash. I'm all about the fash. I'm all about the far right. Blood and
there's no market in it. May or may not have done the market research there, but
it's
no, I think yeah,
you know what I mean. Like it's
yeah,
easy for people to say, because grifter now has turned into, you say something I don't like, or I think you make more money than you do. My neighbor, for the last 6 months, he just moved back across the imaginary line, is a podcaster and author of books, a man named Ben Burgess. And people say hilarious things about who they think he is. And I'm like, dude, you live in a smaller place than mine. Like, I know how much money you make, and it's not that much money. And he went to a wedding. He was invited to Crystal Ball's wedding. And some show did a whole show, and someone took a picture of them at the wedding. And it was like him and Katie Halper and Brianna Joy Gray. Just happy. He was invited to something. He went, and these people did a whole show about how everyone in the picture was a millionaire. And my neighbor, who I know personally, who was literally sitting in my apartment when he saw this, we were cracking up because they were just saying the most outlandish things about him. And he's all kinds of a sellout, and he's this, that, and the third.
yeah.
I'm like, how can he be all these things at once? And there are literally people that, you know what I mean, that actually do make all that
Yeah,
damn money.
it's definitely become like, and it is the idea of grifting, not the phrase selling out, but I think they are, basically
Same
the
thing.
same.
Yeah.
That's become, I think, in the last few years, it's a way to discredit somebody's political position. But I may or may not have called someone or anyone a grifter, but it seems to me like, isn't it, what's so bad about it, in one sense? Like, yeah, you're kind of, you're following your material interests, or like that should be legitimate, as long as you're sort of, there are certain, I don't know, maybe I'm just I'm excusing myself for my like possible future like rebranding. I mean, I'm not sure I'll go full Zig Heil, but you want to keep it as an option potentially. But I guess my sort of point is like, what is wrong with this kind of idea of like, particularly political? I think maybe that's the difference. Political actors compared to musical like context. Like, yeah, you can say something which is in your group's material interest. What's the what's the problem with that? Do you think people are calling people grifters? I guess basically my question is to kind of say like, you're not authentic, you're operating in bad faith, you're lying.
Yes.
And therefore we don't have to listen to you, because it doesn't seem that last bit follows for me. Like,
it doesn't make sense. Like, so if you think about punk, so I grew up listening to like punk and hardcore music of the early 80s. And one of the great things about that studio is I got to meet some of my heroes, right? And what I do now on the show is what I did there in this warehouse, just talking to people and asking them questions. And I wrote a piece, I self-published it in Medium, called I Was a Teenage Anarchist. And it's kind of about the rise of hardcore punk, but looking at its rise in the political economy of the 80s, that moment that Reagan and Thatcher kind of step in, and how this music was kind of a pushback against a conservative culture that they felt was kind of crashing down on them, and the realities that they were seeing around them, that they weren't going to have the same middle class existence as their parents, because the opportunities that their parents had weren't really there. But these guys weren't necessarily anti the world like I think we wanted them to be, because the moment they got access to corporate venues and sponsorships, they took them. And some people look at that as selling out, But again, when you know these cats, you're like, man, they didn't make any money back then. And now they have an opportunity to, if someone comes to them and says, hey, let's license a shirt to sell at Hot Topic, you may say, well, they sold out. It's like, well, okay, if you think so, but now he can pay his rent. And some of these people are homeless. And some of these people live in super subsidized, housing and environments. And so I think we look at that term, we put our own definition on it, and we never really talk to the people themselves. Like, I'm not going to lie, I'm a Metallica fan because that, for me, when I was a little kid, was the heaviest, craziest thing I'd ever heard. And getting to meet people in that world, one thing I will say about that band, like them or not, they've kind of done what they've wanted to do. I don't like every album that they put out. I think a lot of their stuff is kind of but it is what they want to do, whether you like it or not. And just because you're successful doesn't mean you're selling out. And I think for a lot of people, what they deem success, once the uncool people like you, then you've sold out to somebody, right? And I will be honest, my co-host and I, Pascal Robert, had done, we had a contract to do some shows through a much larger channel, and there were moments of it that weren't fun because we had to have feedback after a show, and they were like, well, we don't really like it when you guys say this thing, so can you please not say this thing because this might upset the donors. And I felt a certain way about it because of my punk roots, but ultimately I got what they were trying to say. It was just one thing that I was making fun of that maybe I shouldn't have made fun of, and we moved on. Is that why? I guess, you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I guess it's a difficult, or with podcasting specifically, you don't have that instant feedback, and we do have our Patreon subscribers will tell us that they don't like stuff. Pretty much everything that we put out gets
every week. Yes, God forbid what you guys get on this one.
Well, no, I think people make their own mind up. But I guess that that kind of feedback loop, it's almost as soon as somebody with a suit and tie comes in and tells you what to do. That's the dangerous kind of political point. But I guess to move, we can kind of maybe revisit some other time this selling out conversation.
Sorry about that.
No. If we end up finding some opportunities to sell out, I think that's my problem, is not the lack of desire to do it, lack of opportunity. But we'll see in the future.
If you guys hear a Magic Spoon ad, that's how you know the Alpha Bunga Boys sold out, when you hear the $30 cereal ad.
But they're all American ads. I don't know if there was a kind of a British version of Magic Apron. Is that it? No, Blue Apron. See, and MailChimp. These are the things that I've had advertised to me. I can't even remember the name of the brand, so I'm clearly not a good. Don't have a good enough memory.
You'll be pitching it in no time once you see that check.
Yeah. I mean, we should get those brand names bleeped out by Alex. Otherwise, they've just got free advertising.
F those people. Yeah.
But no, I wanted to talk about De La Soul because you've written most recent piece in Sublation, Stakes is High. So and there's a lot to talk about here, and was a good excuse to just go back and listen to some, for me at least. So thank you.
I wrote it playing. I finished it playing Me, Myself, and I, and it ended at Stakes is High. Like, I'm not even trying to be funny. That's how long it took me to write it. Nice. All those records played in succession.
Nice. I mean, I have occasionally written some things whilst listening to like a live album, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's sort of all the like finish the thing and all the crowd's cheering, and I'm like, wow, yeah, I've guys, you're too kind. Um, but it's nice when you get those synergies. But no, I just wanted to read out a little bit on this from this, and yeah, just because I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about. And so you say the emergence of De La Soul marks the
Mm-hmm.
end of looking at hip hop music as one that is entrenched in underclass ideology. They were from
Mm-hmm.
the suburbs and they didn't posture as gangsters even when it was a dominant trend. Their
Mm-hmm.
music and colourful visual representation was a stark departure from the Adidas tracksuit, Kangol hats, and gold chains imagery of the genre. Sonically vibrant and eclectic, they combined funk sounds of the 70s and early 80s with what we now call yacht rock of the
Mm-hmm.
AM Gold era. They were the first rap group to incorporate humorous skits in their albums and weren't afraid to smile in photos and make fun of themselves. The emergence of De La Soul and the native tongues allowed rap music to become more than simply ghetto tales of masculine bravado and inner city violence. So, I mean, that's, I think, a great appraisal of that group. But I wanted to ask a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
about this idea of underclass ideology. What
Mm-hmm.
do you sort of take that to mean?
Defective Negroes. These Negroes are just defective at birth, and we can't fix them. The kind of Daniel Moynihan, they don't have fathers, and
Right.
and that's why they're violent, and that's why they're shooting up the schools. They're all on government assistance. And there's an ideology around that was very prevalent in the late 80s and early 90s. It's actually a conversation that I'm seeing happening a lot again now. And sadly, I'm seeing it happen in a lot of, quote, black spaces. And it makes me kind of uncomfortable to see this thing being reiterated because it led to a massive crime bill in the 1994. I don't think we're going to see sweeping federal legislation again, but I do think on the state level, we're going to start seeing kind of the aftermath of the George Floyd summer, which is going to be very, very hard state level sentences on petty theft and probably a new definition again on violent crime, which definitely happens in 94. For me personally, the first major wave of hip hop, so it's like the Run DMC and Cold Crush and all that stuff, Grand Melly Mel and the Furious Five and all those guys. It was more braggadocio, right? And then by the late 80s, you get the rise of NWA, who a very good black academic friend of mine says to him feels like it was straight out of the mind of D.W. Griffith. I don't necessarily agree with that 100%.
Whether it's true or not, it's a good line.
It's a good line, and that really kind of took off. And De La Soul comes out around the same time, and actually those guys were on similar bills, surprisingly. And the fun that those guys were able to have with music and to take rap in this whole nother direction with their layering of samples, they really were creating whole new sonic landscapes with the way they sampled on those first few records. And I think the music will be forever changed. I mean, there's a direct line you can draw from De La Soul to Kanye West.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely agree. I think so if it's like this late 80s, particularly American ideology, this kind of underclass ideology, and like the way that you put it is like that hip hop was end of looking at hip hop music as entrenched in underclass ideology. How, like, where did it go next? Or, because obviously, or at least my like,
stay there for a long time.
yeah, my starting point would be that when you see these cultural expressions of, of and some ideological like trend or something like that, it often precedes the political or the wider expression of them. So if it's the beginning of the end, like, yeah, what happened to hip hop or what would your take be kind of after this kind of potential route out of underclass ideology? Did it stay there? Is it still there today? What's
Oh
your
yeah,
what's
it's
your read on this?
It's still there today. Hip hop today, the best line I ever heard. We were sitting at the warehouse one day, and these rappers shot a video, and they had all these fancy cars, like what's the fancy car you people make over there? Maybach? Is that made over there by you?
Maybach, maybe.
Is it a
Aston
Bentley? Is
Martin's a
Aston Martin or Bentley one of those
Bentley,
cars? They had all these
Rolls-Royce.
cars. They had some
Yeah.
Rolls Royces. They were all rented though, right? And they shot the video on a freaking green screen. And so across the street from the studio it just got cleared a month ago, was one of the largest homeless encampments. And it was the largest homeless encampment in the city of Oakland. And as they're moving cars in and out, the sun is setting, and a bunch of people in the home. I mean, there's hundreds of people in this encampment. It's massive. If you've ever seen the movie Sorry to Bother You, the scene where the guy is driving down the street, that is literally our street. There's no actors there. It's just the
Oh,
camp.
right.
And the camp got much, much bigger after that movie. And so there's these big double doors. We call them the zombie gate. And they open up the gate to get one car out, another car in. And as we're doing that, the sun was setting, and you saw the homeless people having a barbecue, right? And you see this rented Bentley driving in front of it very arrogantly. And a friend of mine said, when I see something like that, dude, I just think to myself, all lives matter. And we all started laughing. And he goes, hip hop today looks like a Living Color skit of what people thought hip hop looked like in the 90s.
Do you think that's the kind of become self parody like many cultural forms do? Yeah. I mean,
yeah, man.
do you have any hope for like, because I guess my sort of most of the music that I listen to is, in indie rock or math rock, but basically like 3 guitars and 1 bass and some drums maybe. And I don't know, maybe it's just getting older. It probably is to a certain
Smart
extent, but I'm
drummer,
like,
a really smart
yeah,
drummer,
like
right? Yeah.
some cool time signatures, and I'm like, oh well, this isn't as, obviously when you're sort of, in your teens, you listen to everything and you're like, whoa, that's amazing. But I've sort of started to think, well, it doesn't shock me anymore. There's nothing like completely new where I'm like, wow, I haven't heard anything that even remotely sounds like that. I've got to listen to everything that band's ever put out. I've got to go and see them. And like I said, that could just be like getting old, as we all end up doing. But I'm just, I guess my point in this is partly to ask, like, do you have any like optimism for hip hop as some music that you can kind of like, it's gonna shock you with something new? Or because pop music, it seems like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you were saying previously, it's now maybe an increasing embrace of its own inauthenticity. So
Yes.
what you're going to get. So where can we look to for anything interesting culturally, or should we not? Because maybe that's a kind of an old modernist idea. You're going to have some like something which shocks you out of your like torpor and like makes you realize the way things are going, and maybe like music isn't the place to look for that anyway, and if you're not into some atonal Schoenberg or something. Anyway, that's quite a rambling question, but
is there any hope for music or hip-hop? I'll tell you this.
I guess that's the question.
Hip-hop, I think, is interesting because it isn't for me anymore. And when I say that, I mean that the newer stuff isn't for me. Much like rock has a classic side, hip-hop has a classic side now. That's how old it is. And I dig that about hip-hop, that it can be old enough that when my friends get mad about some of the newer stuff, I can go, look, dude, it's not for us. That's fine. We're in our mid-40s. We shouldn't want to care what a 19-year-old is saying. It shouldn't hit us emotionally what a 19-year-old is saying in our 40s. And there's people my age that are making decent records. I have heard stuff over the years that's like, oh, that was interesting. I mean, mostly now I'm going back and revisiting stuff that maybe I wasn't too keen on as a younger person because it wasn't cool. The samples De La Soul was able to take, actually that whole clique of people able to take, kind of expanded a lot of our musical palettes. But I think when I was younger, I was listening to it to try to find a sample instead of just like listening to some of the quality, the musicianship. Like now I can listen to a song like Asia by Steely Dan and just get blown away by that end drum solo because it's kind of a massive drum solo. You hear, you're like, dude, he wrote that? Like, that's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, shout out to any Steely Dan fans who listen to the podcast. I mean, that whole album's brilliant, and Countdown to Ecstasy. Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
yeah, I think, but Steely Dan are like, you sort of said about like the 19-year-olds. I remember, listening to or not listening to Steely Dan and
Mm-hmm.
Talking Heads because my parents liked them. So I was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is obviously
Mm-hmm.
crap. And then
Mm-hmm.
being sort of dismayed that listening to it and thinking this is really good. What does this mean? Does this mean that kind of maybe musical tastes are a little bit kind of contextual and you're supposed to like the stuff that people in the older generation can't? Yeah, if you're 19 and all the people in their 40s 50s are liking this, then that's not the right music. It has to be a little bit more
Yes.
oppositional. Otherwise it's not it's not exciting enough.
There's some dope stuff, like, back to our authenticity thing and about stuff that I'm going back and listening to and appreciating. Is there's a group, speaking of Talking Heads, called the Tom Tom Club, who is the husband and wife part of the Talking Heads, and I can't think of the name of the song. Do 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 do. What is it?
That wordy rapping here.
Whatever that song is on the Tom
Oh,
Tom Club record.
yeah,
And that lovely boyfriend. So anyway,
I think
so
it's Genius of Love. Genius of Love, I
okay,
think.
Genius of Love, Genius of Love. Thank you, Genius of Love. So we all thought that's that woman playing the bass line. Turns out she's like, nah, dude, I never played that bass line. I wrote that bass line, but I was doing so much recording. She's like, my fingers were just tired. So two other guys recorded that bass line. That's not me. And if you listen to them play it live and you listen to the way it's recorded, it does sound a little different. But I still dig the song. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I guess, go back to Steely Dan, they brought in a lot of session musicians
so many.
and
Michael
probably
McDonald. Yeah.
quite poorly in many cases.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, maybe to kind of move to like, how does all this relate to? No. I'm supposed to be the host and not the one who's like just interrupting you while you're making a point to just say how much I like Steely Dan. That's not super professional on my part, but
we can have Steely Dan fandom. Steely Dan fandom is totally okay.
So I guess one of the main things that I did want to talk to you about is this idea of sort of spectacles, not classes, but the spectacle, that kind of society of the spectacle, or this idea that, kind of classic critique that would basically undercut the point of what we've just been talking about with music, particularly pop music, that this is all, essentially a construction, a distraction, part of what distances people from from thinking about politics, from acting politically, or maybe even like acting at all, in the sense of just becoming passive consumers of these mediatized spectacles. And so in one of the pieces you say, when we can't settle for justice, when we can't get justice, we settle for catharsis.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you mean by this?
Yeah. If you think about the George Floyd moment, and I wrote that piece. A friend of mine who's a musician, if you do like math rock, and if you're a fan of groups like the Melvins, he actually plays with Dale Crover of the Melvins in his band. His name is Conan Neutron. His group's called Conan Neutron and the Secret Friends. And we were having a conversation one day, me, him, and Ben, and he said that we were talking about people being frustrated and nothing really happening. And there's something cathartic about those protests that you saw, but nothing really happened. You got a lot of titular changes. You got a lot of like, we're going to rename the police, but they're still the police if you really want to abolish them. We're going to have, underpaid, sometimes third party the healthcare workers come out instead of law enforcement for certain situations. And some of these things have led to less negative interactions with law enforcement. But I wouldn't say that there was a movement. You know, if you look at Minneapolis, and that's what I do in the piece, they weren't able to get any of the reforms that they really wanted when it came to law enforcement. They was going to rename the police or get rid of the police. And I asked the question, like, who captured that energy after all was said and done? And it was hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage to that city. And when cars are getting overturned, sometimes it's the cars of working class people that need those cars to get to work. And, you know, we saw this in 91. It happened in the 60s. And these expressions with the cries of the unheard, you know, at a certain point, it's just a cathartic exercise. And there's something to be said about the fragmented nature of the way we see the world, all of us. And we can only come together in these times of tragedy. And while we saw the world, for the most part, blow up over the George Floyd thing, which is, of course, freaking horrible, I was watching France. And I was like, this is about pension age. The Social Security age went up in the U.S. I don't think anybody knocked over a coffee cup. SNAP benefits got cut. That affected like 30-some million people in the United States. I didn't see anyone, you know, yell at a crossing guard. So why do we get mad about these certain things that have to fit in a box? And granted, I think there's other factors that led to all the stuff that happens with George Floyd. But, you know, there's been other instances where these massive protests have happened. And the answer is always a one-size-fits-all answer. So it's just the police. If we just defund the police, we'll fix poverty. And I don't think anyone really thought to say, well, is this really the answer? And then somebody might even say, well, no, defund the police had more to it than that. And there were these anti-poverty. It's like, okay, but the only messaging that most people got and the real mission was, this is the problem, is police. And once we get rid of them, then all the other ills go away. Just like the idea that Medicare for all comes in, and this is in the U.S. context, right? And then all your problems go away. It's gonna fix a lot. These reforms would be massive. They would help a lot, but it's not going to make all the problems go away. And when certain places had defunded police, or maybe money was moved to other sectors of the budget, people saw how police respond. And right now, what we're seeing in the U.S. is a lot of places that just have Democratic leadership in the municipalities. There's a huge push of the citizens saying, we need you guys to lock these guys up for longer. You're not locking people up for petty crime. Now the petty crime is becoming somewhat violent. People are starting to get beat over the head for stupid stuff. This isn't the 90s. In the 90s, we have to remember that because of the influx of very cheap cocaine that you can rock up and turn into crack, you can turn a brick of coke into $50,000 to $70,000 overnight. So you're talking about crack houses and blocks worth millions of dollars, and you have a distribution network in street gangs. So the violence of that era definitely trumps what we're seeing now. But for people our age and even a little younger, there is a memory of that time, especially in places like New York. There's a reason why Eric Adams got elected mayor. And I'm not saying these are good things. These are just observations. And there's a fear cats have about returning back to that lawless city that New York was. There's a fear for people that Los Angeles will become, you know, kind of that war zone that it was. I don't think so. But I do understand the concerns when California spent $17 billion on homelessness, and we officially have the most homeless people I still say we, even though I don't live in California anymore, than any other state in the U.S. And people are frustrated and they're blaming Democratic leadership, rightfully so, and saying, you have to fix it. You have to lock these people up. We don't want to see the blight anymore. And I am seeing a return again to, as I said earlier, the underclass ideology rhetoric, and kind of, I almost feel like a doubling down on the American ideals of who's worthy for what. And
in what sense? Because I think when you sort of said, when you were talking about like the fear of the lawless city, I was going to sort of ask something about like, is this the echo of the underclass ideology?
Yes.
Today,
Yes.
but
from
when you
no,
say,
but from the 70s. Not even from the
right,
90s, but from this, like that first Reagan term in office, where it's like the problem is these
right,
defective moms, these people that are welfare cheats. Like the problem, like what's interesting is, if you think about social services as a way to protect, regular citizens from the freedom of the market and not punishment for being poor, and even people that may even call themselves leftists, I didn't see the outrage of the cutting of SNAP benefits, which is going to affect tons of children. I don't see the same outrage. You know what I mean? Even with homelessness, I worked in a massive shelter. It was a big hotel in Oakland, and I didn't see a lot of outrage. No one really cares about people when you put them away. It's almost like, it's not almost like, when you deal with surplus populations, and this is going to sound gross, nobody really gives that much of a damn about you, and you don't have that much of a say so. And even people that want to be activists, it's like, do you really care about these people? There was a moment where
yeah,
people were telling people not to go to some of the shelter hotels because there were curfews and rules. And they were like, well, there's rules there and there's curfews and that's demeaning. I'm like, well, there's rules everywhere. There's rules in the townhouse that I'm staying in right now. There's rules in most apartment complexes. And when you have 300 people that have been abiding by their own personal rules for sometimes long periods of time, you have varying degrees of mental illness that you're dealing with. There needs to be some sort of order in play. Nobody's bullying people with rules. We don't want to be cops. We want everybody to enjoy their stay. They have their own bathroom for the first time. We want cats to enjoy this moment. But there still has to be some sort of rules, because these are violent environments. And I don't think people understood, when you have certain reforms, when you're going to have less time for people that do petty crime, it might get a little worse before it gets better. And these conversations were never had, because, again, the answer was one size fits all. Once you stop doing X, then Y goes away.
I guess that's a kind of a structure of thinking that you see quite a lot. That kind of magical, like, if only we could do this one thing, it would solve sort of all the problems. It's the magic, it's the key that can just unlock, the shortcut almost to a just and equal society, however it's phrased in the minds of people who kind of proceed along these lines. But I guess I wanted to sort of link this to, because you're kind of touching on it as you were saying it, but the spectacle, like, are we all addicted to this, the kind of, I guess, the spectacular way of consuming politics, i.e., we're distanced from it. It's mediatized, it's mediated. Like in the George Floyd case, the kind of it was, it's not a question of here's some changes to numbers with pension kind of age changes, but here is a
Yeah.
spectacular event, and here it can be distributed. It is part of something which is consumed by the viewer, by the news viewer. And I wanted to read out some. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I did my preparation, so I want to
Dope.
steamroll through it. So De Boer in Society of Spectacle
Mm.
says, in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was once directly lived has moved away into a representation. And he says the spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. So I guess the question is like,
Mm.
is this how we, are we all addicted to the spectacle in the sense of it's the way we consume politics and it's the way we want to consume politics?
Want and the way we do, I think, is different. I think it's the only way we know how. So I don't know if I'd say the word want. I think we consume politics the way we consume pro wrestling. It's good guys and bad guys, and there's a lot of kayfabe involved.
Yeah, just explain this
Sure.
this term to listeners who might not.
Kayfabe. Kayfabe
Yeah.
is an old vaudeville term, and it's kind of like the code, the magician's code. You never let people know about the secret. You never tell them that wrestling is fake. For years, even to this day, if you get a wrestler in a news interview and you ask them if it's fake, they'll either show you like injuries. They've been known as slap reporters. My favorite is I can't remember the wrestler's name, but he slaps the hell out of John Stossel from formerly of ABC, and I think John Stossel lost hearing this year.
Whoa.
But kayfabe is kind of, when you watch wrestling, there's a bad guy called a heel and a good guy is called a babyface, and everyone knows it's fake. There's not anyone in the modern era that's why even in the 80s no one's watching wrestling going, oh, is this real or fake? All the matches are predetermined, but what do you watch it for? You watch for the spectacle of it all. You watch for the guy, the heel that comes out with the fabulous robe. You love the crap talk that they do. And I think for me, it really started to make sense about kind of the political era being full of kayfabe, with the Trump, Sanders, Clinton run for president. I found that fascinating.
Who was the heel? Was Hillary Hillary? No.
Well, Hillary is kind of she thinks she's the baby face, but she's kind of the assistant heel, if you will. And Donald Trump is one of those almost like 90s era wrestlers where it was the attitude era. And it's interesting to watch all this stuff play out because this is the way we relate to stuff. There's good guys and there's bad guys. There's 400 people in Congress in the United States. There's like 5 people everybody knows. And again, we were speaking at a university the other day, and I brought that up when people talk about, were you guys part of the cult of Bernie or whatever the question was? I'm probably getting it wrong. And I think our political imagination is gone because of the spectacle. Barack Obama kind of shows us that, right? Here's a guy that's just a state senator for what, like 1.5 terms, a state senator. Before presidents were governors, because if you're a governor, you're kind of a president of your own little country. Right?
You've done your management training.
Yeah, you can call the National Guard. Yeah. You were a district manager, right? And you got the state senator that wins, and you're kind of like, okay, this guy doesn't have any experience doing anything, and it's okay because he speaks so well. He's so well spoken, and he's really smart. He's smarter than the last guy because the last guy was an idiot, right? This is. I'm just kind of overgeneralizing a lot of the conversation that was had during that 2008. So by the time you get Donald Trump, you can really only have Donald Trump because you have Barack Obama. Donald Trump tried to run a long time ago, and it definitely fell flat on his face because everyone's like, well, you're a joke. You don't have any experience in politics. No one cared about his non-experience. He had been the spectacle for 40 years. In my entire lifetime being aware of the television, I've known who Donald Trump is. And then he spent all those years with that Apprentice show pretending that he was the richest, most powerful man in the world. And that's all pro wrestling. That's all pro wrestling. And it worked. He pro wrestled himself right into the White House, and definitely pro wrestled himself right out of it. And I don't think he's going to come back. But still, the way we relate to politics is just so good guy, bad guy that now you have politicians that just kind of play up the good guy, bad guy narrative for people. I really believe that, the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Boberts of the world are just playing their role as heel. These are people that
go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, because I think the idea of Trump as a kind of attitude era 90s wrestler basically hits the nail on the head, like a good shit talker, and doesn't actually need to know how to fight, but can get in the ring before he gets in the ring. Can definitely talk a
Steve Austin. Game. He's Steve Austin.
Yeah, Stone Cold Donald Trump.
Stone Cold, yeah.
But I think, but what does this say about us as the kind of, because wrestling is kind of enjoyable to see a Royal Rumble for the presidency. That I'd watch that. But what is it? Because you say in the article that we're in a moment that's characterized by the profound absence of mass politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess this is the kind of the classic spectacle analysis that there's something we like about it to the extent that we kind of accept our position as spectators, and we allow ourselves to enjoy it somehow. I mean, is that right? I mean, are we sort of
we love drama,
like we go to the left as a lifestyle brand of one sort of like way that we're trying to kid ourselves of kind of exiting the spectacle. I mean, is there actually a way out, or like are we condemned to just be cheering for candidates in a kind of already pre-decided wrestling match of politics, if you want to put it that way?
I think first and foremost, people have to remember that we have to get back to real meet spaces and talk to each other in real life. I'll try to be brief. I'm sorry. I'm trying to collect my thoughts. Because
I guess it's a bit of an unfair question.
No, it's a good question. No. I want to.
Also a bit ironic that, like, I agree we need to be in meet spaces, but we're obviously having this conversation
across the pond
remotely, and then people will listen to it asynchronously when it gets released, and so got to be aware of the the limitations and the size of the task, I guess.
We have to understand. So the other day I was in LA meeting with a friend that worked in local politics, but he also worked in Hollywood, and we were talking about. So I have a feature length video documentary that I'm going to be screening, hopefully this year, called Kayfabe, and it's about the way we consume media. And he's helping me, put together some strategies for how we're going to screen it and stuff like that. And we were talking a little bit about his time in local politics as well, and he was telling us about there's a flag at a veterans park, and you always have to have lights on a flag in the U.S. I don't know if the same way where you are. They always have to be shown on the flag, and if a light goes out, there's 3 different divisions of the city that are in charge of 3 different lights around this park.
Wow, that's definitely not the same in this country. We don't have this old glory kind of like respect for the flag. The Union Jack, I think, is the brand is a bit tarnished.
It's not the same. Sorry. So no, I get it. And so he's telling us about how people called him when he had his position, and they would say, the lights out. He goes, well, can you take a picture for me? They're like, we're not going to take a picture for you. Just come down here and change it. The lights out. And he's like, I understand that, but I need to see a picture because I need, and before he could even say, I need to know who to send, they were just like, just get down here and change it. And, then he'd have to drive down, find out which light is out, and divvy it up to the right department. But I don't think people understand the levels of bureaucracy that are involved with politics. I don't think they understand that in this current context. The good, not good thing, but the thing that Trump did for the GOP, or maybe both parties if they wanted, I don't know, was all these conservative judges are kicking so many rights back to states that now these governors are almost like kings of their own small little fiefdoms. And I think I talk about it a little bit in that piece. So like we saw that with abortion, right? It's up to the states. We're not going to have any federal sweeping legislation. So presidents alone have a lot less power. Joe Biden, when he passes his real kind of flimsy reform to let all these people out for weed charges, I don't think anybody even got out because that would have had to have been federal charges, and it wasn't even for like transporting pot back then because he couldn't pardon anybody for state charges. So I don't think we understand how much power governors and mayors and district attorneys have sheriffs have. And because we're so disconnected from the way these things actually operate, we don't understand, and the solutions that we pose don't really work. And sometimes it's easy to get involved at a protest because once you do it, you're done, right? I've made my sign, I shouted, there's a picture of me there. I was there, where were you? And it's like, I was doing paperwork. Because movements cool. Aren't fun, right? Movements aren't fun. Movements are paperwork. It's phone calls. It's fundraising.
I kind of like paperwork and spreadsheets and all that sort of thing.
You know what? Say that kind of stuff more, and then we can actually have a real movement, because we all know it's not all, spectator protests and throwing cans of soup at cops, fighting the power.
Emails.
It's boring. Yeah,
meet in spaces and getting the venues and all of that. Stuff.
Dealing with people to form coalitions. The best thing I ever did with my life, I feel, besides being a dad, is working at the homeless shelter, because it didn't pay good and it's a very thankless job, but the people that do it, I think, are amazing people. If you know anyone that works at a place like that, hug them. They need it, trust me. I got a lot of autonomy while I was there to do what I wanted to do. So I wanted to turn this place into a resort. That was my whole thing. I was like, if we really want to try to do anything about the conditions for people, we have to stop trying to just warehouse them and wonder why no one can get out of this shit. And because of the people that I knew from like the music world and just my friend circle for over the years, we had literal professional trainers coming in, helping people with movement and mobility issues. We had yoga. We had art therapy classes. We actually put a school together from other unhoused people there that taught, and we had some kids there. I don't want to say it was fun. I mean, we tried to make it as fun as possible. You know what I mean? But I had a vision, and I think for a time people were on board. I won't get into the particulars of why I had to leave, but
I guess that's kind of the opposite of the spectacle in a way. That like maybe that's I don't want to be too trite. The thing to do is the less spectacular, the better, the more.
I'm not bragging about it on social. Well, I'm talking about it now, but it wasn't like I was taking pictures every 5 minutes to be like, look at what I'm doing. It was.
You didn't do it for the gram. I mean, did it even really happen?
Dude, I did it because it needed to be done first and foremost, and number two, I lost everything at one point in time. I lived in a van. I was homeless. So I come from the same place as these people, right? We're all the same. Yeah. And you're just doing your job, and it's for the community that I'm from. And I was surprised that when people would meet me and I started doing my show and I would talk about these things. We did a Mother's Day episode. It's one of the early. We have 400 and some episodes now, over 500 actually, because we have different show titles and stuff. But one of the earlier shows, I think show like 25, I did a Mother's Day episode because a woman wanted to get her hair done and we couldn't have guests. And she got mad at me and she looked at me. She goes, "I can't even get my hair done on Mother's Day. What the hell is this?" And it kind of fucked me up because I thought to myself, she just wants to look pretty. And because of the rules, and they're in place for very good reason, trust me, couldn't have people in and out. And I talked, and we didn't have anything planned these places don't give a damn about the holidays. It's just another day to them. And so I said on air to a very, very small following, any help you guys can have for Mother's Day would be huge if we could make this kind of a nice day for these people, for these women. And people I didn't know, George, just swarmed to the shelter and just gave all this stuff. There was flowers, there was candy, there was food, there was gift cards. I mean, that's kind of it may seem like charity fairy tale stuff, but for a moment, people understand that these aren't just a throwaway population of people. You know what I mean? Yeah. The underclass ideology went away for a minute. And some of these people still even got involved with the shelter themselves that came down to donate. So
great. Thanks so much, Jason, for being with us. So just listeners, we'll link to all the articles we discussed in the show notes and check out more from Jason over at sublationmag.com. And just a final plug for Jason's documentary. And I thought it was pronounced kayfabe. So I did clearly. I'm not
kayfabe. Yeah, it's kayfabe. Yeah. So there's a whole playlist on the This Is Revolution YouTube page of all the mini documentaries that I made, or video essays, whatever you want to call them. I'm definitely influenced by one of your countrymen, Adam Curtis, stylistically.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think he's had such a, I don't know, such an influence on, like, you can just put two things together and let the viewer make a connection, and it works. Yeah. I think it works really well. And final plug for, again, this is Revolution. Check that out, listeners. But yeah, Jason, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Rabat ou Panama, La Paz ou Ottawa, Islamabad on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Beyrouth ou Copenhague, Belmont, Panou, La Hague, San Salvador on fait le Bunga, Bunga, Zagreb ou Washington,